Dear colleagues and students, you may have been wondering why we use the word systemic design for health. Now, today, I will give you a brief introduction to systems thinking and systemic design. My name is Koen De Wandeler. I'm an associate professor with the Faculty of Architecture at KU Leuven. Now, in our summer schools this year and the one of next year, we are seeking to develop a way of systems practice. And that consists basically of two components. First of all, we have systemic systems analysis and mapping, which is a way to approach adaptive issues in complex environments. Adaptive means that these issues keep changing over time according to external or internal changes. That makes them extremely complex. And the way to analyze this is notably by identifying the relationships between different elements within this system and map them so that we gain insight and clarity in these issues. And by mapping them, we may identify leverage points. And the better the leverage points, the better our chances to make enduring social change in that adaptive issue. Now, once we have the leverage points, we can start to develop systemic design tools. And that means that we change the system from within. We use the resources of the system to improve them, which means also that we use the human resources within the system. That involves a collaborative co-creation sessions. Now, today's lecture will be subdivided in three parts. First of all, I'll talk about systems thinking, then about systemic design, and finally, I will give you a first insight in the case study assignment that you will be working on later in this fortnight. What is a system? It's a set of things that is interconnected, that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own patterns of behavior over time. Now, the best way to illustrate this is to show you a phenomenon that is quite often seen in the Northern Hemisphere, where at dusk we have flocks of starlings, particularly starlings, that are performing a kind of ballet in the sky. And it starts with a smaller flock, and that flock of birds grows bigger and bigger over time. Now, the reason why these birds make these patterns is basically because there is no leader. There is no particular pattern, preset pattern, but every bird follows the movement of the bird next to it. So why do they do this? They just assemble in large numbers to chase away birds of prey that may attack an individual starling, and they chase them away before they settle in a brooding ground, before they go to sleep, basically. So this illustrates that a system always has three parts. It has the elements, the birds in that case. It has the interconnections, the relationships or stories that hold all the elements of that system together, and they have a purpose. And the purpose is deduced from their behavior. So here, at the left-hand side, you have an illustration of a system. All the dots are elements, and you will see if you watch very closely that there's arrows connecting all those different dots, meaning what is the influence of one dot on the other. Those are the interconnections, and there's a purpose to the system. Now, system characteristics. We have, every system has boundaries, hierarchies, and interconnectivity. To the right-hand side, you see, for example, the connections that lead to food production and finally the consumption over distribution, processing, marketing, purchasing, consumption, and waste recovery, leading again to food production. Now, this is really a good example of how a system is interconnected in a circular way. But when we now look in more detail, we see that it's rather more complicated, that this food production cycle is involving different systems. It involves farming system. It involves an economic system where the processing, marketing, and purchasing is involved. It involves a social system where people choose to consume certain food, and it involves an environmental system. So we all are part of a system, of several systems. Now, we can change systems by changing our perspective and our boundaries. So the boundaries can be spatial, can be temporal, or can be conceptual. And I'll give you an example towards the end of this lecture. Now, so systems are basically not the traditional way of thinking. Traditional ways of thinking is rather straightforward, is linear thinking. One cause leads to one effect. That effect may be the cause of another effect. When we are systems thinking, we have to approach things rather differently, as you can see here. So one cause may have several effects in different systems. Now, what it involves, it means basically that we need to be zooming in to the system, to the moving parts, and we need to zoom out in order to get the overall view. Rather than looking at the elements in separately, we need to look for patterns in those relationships, basically looking at the in-between spaces, in between the elements. So the zooming in can mean that we have to really look at a mini scale into molecules or other very, very small elements. And the zooming out may mean that we have to look at a global or even interstellar way of relations. Now, systems thinking is different from the traditional linear way of thinking in the sense that we basically look at interconnections between the elements, that we think in a circular way rather than in a linear way, that we look at emerging patterns rather than subdividing in silos, that we look at the wholes rather than the parts in a synthetic kind of way, rather than only concentrating on analysis, and that we look at the relationships rather than at the elements in isolation. Other things we have to keep in mind is that basically every system works with stocks and flows. The best example that we can give is the example of the bathtub. There's obviously an inflow, and the bathtub itself is a stock of water. When we finished our bath, we let the water out, and there's an outflow. So you see it illustrated at the two upper illustrations. But this is applicable to so many things. For example, we have the stock of population in a city, in a region, in a country, basically resulting from births. Birth that produce birth to children. The children mature into adults. The adults produce more children. The adults and the children together contribute to the total population, and eventually the adults also grow older and pass away, which reduces the total population. And we can do this kind of analysis for many, many things. But not only do we see stocks and flows, we also see feedback loops. Now, I give you this example, which is very easy to understand. We all know that temperatures are rising, and that we try to limit the rising of this temperature. So at the left-hand side, you see a balancing feedback loop, meaning that when the temperature is rising, international agencies come together and decide on climate change mitigation actions. So the more the temperature rises, the more mitigation actions will be pronounced. The more climate change mitigation actions are pronounced, hopefully will result in the temperature not rising as fast as it would if there were no mitigation actions. That's called a balancing feedback loop. But on the other hand, we also have reinforcing feedback loops. If the temperature rises, the ice area at our pole is reduced. If the ice area reduced, the reflection of radiation becomes bigger, and the absorption of solar radiation is getting less, and that results in rising temperature. So this system is reinforced by the rising temperature. Now, it can get quite complicated, as you can see in this slide. There's an interconnection not only between the elements, but there's also interconnection between systems. So here you have an example which I will illustrate further through an everyday application. A last element that we have to take into consideration are the leverage points. So the reason for analyzing and mapping a system is basically by identifying stocks and flows, and by identifying, reinforcing, and feedback loops, we'll try to identify leverage points. And the largest possible leverage points will be to shift the paradigm to deal with new challenges. If we talk about climate change, for example, the change of paradigm would be that we stop thinking about growth in the way, economic growth in the way that we are doing now. That would be the largest possible leverage points. We also may work on the balancing feedback loops or on the reinforcing feedback loops, but that will have less leverage. System structure or self-organization might be another way that we find through our mapping, that we find possible to change the system, and that will also have a larger effect. Now, everyday application is probably the best way to illustrate how different systems are interconnected. If a person graduates or has already a job and wants to go through the process of finding a different job, there's a lot that gets involved. There's, of course, the needs and the constitution of the person in question. There's psychological issues, there's health issues, there's the needs, there's the life experience and life expectations. There's also the language and the culture of the person, the education that the person has enjoyed, the circumstances of the moment, and the support networks that the person can rely on. And all these systems have connections with a whole set of subsystems. Now, if we then look at the way that the systems are involved in finding another job, we come to 7 or 8 different systems: the disability services, the health system, the migration, the child protection, the justice system, the education system, the welfare system, and the employment services system. All that to find a job. Now, this is clearly illustrating that systems are well connected and very, very complex. If we now move to systemic design, we have to approach a different way of thinking, namely the design thinking. Designers begin with what is desirable, what people want, the needs, the desires of end users. Now, to design what is desirable, they also have to look at what is feasible and at what is viable. And at the overlap of these 3 elements, they have to find a solution. This is done by human-centered design. Human-centered because they design for their customers and try to bring in new things that these people may be longing for, which means there needs to be, for design thinking, a lot of empathy. There has to be creativity, generating lots of ideas, which are not just launched out of the blue. They are testing those ideas, and gradually, through weighing of the best possible solutions, they make progress in their creative process. Systemic design means basically that we need to combine different elements from, on the one hand, design thinking, and on the other hand, from systems thinking. Systems thinking requires a high level of abstraction. It is geared to action. It is looking at the interconnections of the elements and therefore requires to zoom out. And the main point is basically to identify leverage points. Whereas designers, they also have a bias towards action. They learn by doing because they test their ideas. And in order to test their ideas, they also need to zoom in on the elements and make prototypes. The resulting combination is called systemic thinking, and that requires integration, integrative thinking, which means also that the process of zooming in and zooming out is constantly applied. It is inherently co-creative because in order to test the ideas, there needs to be several professionals and customers that are involved, and it requires a great facilitation. So that's basically what systemic design is all about. And based on these elements, methodologies have been developed. Methodologies that bring together people from different backgrounds to work together, just like you all are from different backgrounds, culturally, linguistically, education and discipline are different. You all are here because you appreciate the different scales at which you can work. You empathize with the stakeholders because this is a workshop on health. And you help each other to challenge boundaries, construct shared frames of reference, and you will, in the course of the workshop at Thammasat Design School, you will visualize alternatives, hopefully, to prevailing paradigms, the paradigms that you will be conducting during your case study work. Now, the case study basically will rely on some of the characteristics of systems thinking. You will be zooming in and zooming out on different scales in order to situate the primary healthcare center that you are looking at. You will be looking at the region, the city, the district, the neighborhood, finally on the building, and even on the materials. You will take into account mobility, energy, water, materials, food. All these are required in order to collect a checklist that establishes how well your primary healthcare center is equipped to work in normal circumstances or in circumstances of emergency. And so your assignment will be working on the spatial boundaries, the multi-scalar spatial analysis. It will be working on temporal elements, routine practice, or in the case that we are looking at, flooding or any other emergency. And it will look at the conceptual perspective, because besides the service that the primary healthcare center delivers to patients, you will also look at the perspective of medical staff, of technicians, suppliers, even district officers. So this is the challenge that we are all facing, and we will definitely make our best way to get all this together at the 2 weeks or 10 days that we will share at the Tamasan Design School. I wish you the best of luck in your case study and hope to see you all in Bangkok. Goodbye.